Welcome everyone to Rebel Impact for another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Rebel Gray, and today we're going to talk about the alternate strategy to winning a game of Destiny, which is discarding all of your opponent's cards. The trick, of course, is that you have to eliminate both your opponent's hand and deck while also surviving the round in which you did that, or forcibly ending the action phase before your last character is defeated in that round. Now, there's also differences between hero mill and villain mill decks, which are subtle, but change strategies between the two significantly. There is, of course, a lot more that surrounds the strategy of milling your opponent than just getting rid of all their cards, and we're going to talk about basically all of those things today. There are many considerations that go into constructing viable discard or mill decks, especially competitive ones. And I'll start by telling you first that discarding all of your opponent's cards is not an easy task at all. In fact, the game is stacked against it. It is just significantly easier to kill your opponent's characters, as many more upgrades in the game have multiple sides for producing damage, and most die cards with discard sides only have one discard side. So as we move through this video, some of those considerations are really going to be more like reasons why mill is so difficult to be successful with. And on a personal note, if you don't already know, I am an avid mill player. I enjoy exploring this side of the game much more than playing aggro, and in turn, I give my local scene a lot of exposure to this side of the game so they know how to think how mill players think. Or at least how I think, which is probably why I lose a lot of games. But anyway, that's my inspiration for wanting to make this video and others regarding this topic going forward. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we go through this video, and I know I've mentioned this in the past, is that I might use the words mill and discard interchangeably, but they are actually distinct terms. Mill is often used to refer to discarding cards off the top of the deck, and it's a term from Magic the Gathering that translates over to Destiny pretty easily. Discard, on the other hand, is a term that this game is going to use for both discarding off the deck or the hand, and cards will direct you to do one or the other in their text. I don't want that to cause confusion, so I just feel like it needed to be said before we really got into the swing of this video. Okay, I think I've said enough in this intro. Let's get started on this big beefy topic after the break. So like any good Destiny deck, the characters are often the most important consideration from the start. As Destiny has evolved as a game, we have seen the progression of what FFG considers acceptable for characters where this alternate strategy is concerned. In Awakenings, the most appropriate character we saw for mill strategies was Jabba the Hutt. And while Jabba doesn't have a fancy activated ability that interacts with the opponent's deck or hand, he does have a 2 discard side, which is pretty beefy. His activated ability also grants you the ability to bring a little added consistency to your yellow dice, which can be pretty good. And as the game released cards like Fast Hands into the mix, Jabba's strength actually increased, and he became a staple card in villain discard decks, even to this day in the Legacies meta. Now with the release of Empire at War, General Reekin made his debut on the hero side, and boy did he change a lot of things. Hero finally had a character that put a mill strategy on the map for them in a way that wasn't just die driven like Padme Amidala had been. We saw the strength of activated abilities in Empire at War with characters like this and others like Thrawn. Reekin's ability, it can't be trifled with, not directly anyway. And you force players to deal with it every single round unless they can affect your board state. Turns out, with other cards in your deck, you can make Reekin a real powerhouse mill card, and to this day, he is still considered a staple for many hero mill decks that try to run red. And now we're in Legacies, and FFG hasn't stopped the mill train from rolling, thankfully. It seems like they're actually really embracing the strategy, because based on the fact that we have seen a lot of cards come into the play that support it, that might suggest that they actually don't mind it so much. And in fact, the poster child for Star Wars, Master Yoda, brought even more life to this alternate strategy. His special makes him a great tool for mill and damage decks alike. He has become something like a support character for mill decks in a way that other characters have been support character for damage decks in the past. And aside from these three characters, there are, of course, many others that we've seen in the past and that we're seeing in the present as well. There's Unkar Plut, there's Thrawn, which I already mentioned, and there's Jedha Partisan. Those are just a few that come to mind. But even those are not the extent of what we have seen in all of Destiny. And the result of all these characters existing has been to offer a wider variety of choices for players who want to play the game with this win condition. And in a later video, I'm actually going to discuss a plethora of different character combinations and their various strategies, strengths, and weaknesses. Something of note too is that roll-off odds are not often a consideration for a mill or discard strategy any more than they are for aggro decks, okay? So when we talk about plots later, that's going to come into play a little bit too. But what you can take from this right now is that the future of mill strategies is pretty bright. It's very bright, actually. And if you can learn to see the game differently, that gives you a huge advantage over others because you'll be able to think like a mill player. Now, of course, naturally, the other choice you must make when it comes to this alternate strategy is the battlefield that you bring into the game. And from the very beginning of the game, FFG gave us two options in Command Center and Jedi Temple. The former was considered a better overall choice, and Jedi Temple could be played around, and that's kind of why Command Center got to the popularity that it got to with mill decks. Jedi Temple's text is too specific, it targets only events, but that said, it's actually not terrible, and I sometimes wonder why it doesn't see more play now, because so many decks out there are heavily event-driven. Command Center sees a fair bit of play on the villain side of things, as those decks generally have a bit harder time milling off of the deck. Their strategies are more focused on discard, and as you saw with Jabba, Thrawn, and Unkar in the last section, Command Center is very strong and is a battlefield that damage decks do fear quite a bit. Potentially losing big upgrades from your deck is a pretty huge hit to your damage output, and so it's often not chosen as the opening battlefield, giving you the ability to take the shield. You can always bring it back later in the game with something like New Orders or Hyperspace Jump, which is often how mill decks approach their later games. That said, you cannot rely entirely on battlefield fear to push your advantage, and as we'll talk about later, a good opponent will know how to gauge your deck speed and may take your battlefield and use it against you. So claim tension often becomes an important component of playing with or against a mill deck. Anyway, going back to the battlefields, Spirit of Rebellion gave us an important battlefield that right now in the Legacies meta of Standard has become the go-to battlefield. And I personally don't like War-Torn Streets, but it has its merits, and it makes a lot of sense to run in Hero Mill decks, especially because Hero Mill decks are actually better at discarding from the deck than the hand, unlike their villain counterparts. The issue here is the same as it is with Command Center, however, right? It comes down to speed. And as mill decks, regardless of faction, they're slow as molasses generally. You may find this battlefield being used against you just as often as you actually get to use it. But discarding a random card from the opponent's hand can be a crucial play in the game. And alongside some of the other considerations that we're going to talk about later, that makes this battlefield a very good choice right now in the present meta. And last but not least, I'm going to mention Imperial Palace, which is a very good battlefield, especially for the Trilogies format, as it's actually the only discard battlefield in that format at this time. But aside from that, it is a little bit like War-Torn Streets that it goes after the hand, but it gives you hand knowledge at the end of the round and allows you to choose the card that you're going to discard from it. So as before, the consideration to take this battlefield can be super advantageous to the claimant. Personally, I'm kind of toying with this battlefield a bit more these days, as there are actually some mill decks that move quite quickly through their turns, although that's not typical. But whichever of these battlefields you choose to take is up to you. Ultimately, however, it will come down to the characters that you choose, whether you use 2 characters or 3 characters, and how fast you can sequence your turns to claim it or not. Alright, so at the time of this video, we only have 6 plots in the game, but among those, several are actually good choices for mill decks, depending on your character setup. So let's talk about those now and how they are relevant in the discussion. So the first and probably the most obvious plot for a mill deck is Espionage. After setup, everyone basically mills 1 card. That means you too, however. So the advantage is that this plot is cheap, it only costs 1 point, It also moves your win condition forward before the game even starts, and that can be great, especially if you don't lose a card, if you don't lose a card that you don't care for, and your opponent lost a big upgrade like an Obi-Wan's lightsaber or something like that. But this is a real give and take, and I'll tell you what my thought process is on espionage. I don't run it unless my entire deck is 2-ofs. If I'm running any card that is critical to my win condition as a 1-of, that I want to see just late game and I didn't want to waste a deck spot on a second one, I'm probably not running this plot, even if I can. So for example, in a deck with Yoda and 2 Partisans, you hit that 29-point spot, and you can run espionage. But if you're running 1 copy of Maz's Goggles in that deck, or you think you can get away with running 1 Hyperspace Jump in that deck, think again, okay? Because even though if you didn't get it in your mulligan to preserve it and it's somewhere in your deck, that's going to be a 1 in 25 shot of basically losing that card, and that is not really good. So you're going to want to shift your cards around, or just don't run this plot. One of these options is often easier than the other, okay? Give it consideration before you make the choice to add it, simply because you can. Next up, we've got Profitable Connections. And this is a pretty good plot for mill decks, hitting that 27-point mark. And right now, that's pretty much E-Yoda, E-Padme. And the extra resource may or may not be worth it depending on your upgrade suite and the overall cost curve of your deck. That said, don't underestimate starting with a 3rd resource, because it can enable different round 1s than you're used to. And that can mean getting out of the round quicker, or allowing different choices on Yoda's special, or playing more cards from your hand. It changes things. And in the few mill decks that can use this plot, it is a very, very good choice in those cases. Now, the last 2 plots that I want to talk about together, because they not only compete for a spot at the 2-point slot, but as far as mill is concerned, they come down to basically the same consideration. And that is how we're going to acquire our starting shields, because most of the time we definitely want those. So on one hand, Fortify is going to guarantee us a shield for those 2 points. For a deck with Riken, that means milling 1 card off the top pretty much immediately. On the other hand, taking ground can significantly increase the chance of getting 2 starting shields. So if we win the roll-off with a +2 result, we can take their battlefield, take 2 shields, and now Riken's online for 2 mil instead of 1. Seems like a good idea, right? Well, perhaps. And it's going to depend quite strictly on what your character setup is, as far as what their roll-off averages are, and whether or not adding +2 to that is going to make a significant enough impact on a result so that you're going to win the roll-off with a higher, outcome. Like, is it going to change from I win the roll-off 30% of the time to 50% of the time, or 50% of the time to 70% of the time, right? One of those increases is a bit more significant than the other, even though they both seem linear. And if you're looking at Riken with 2 Partisans, for example, taking ground might be the best choice, as there's a lot of 2s on those dice. If you're looking at any deck with Yoda, chances are Fortify is the better choice, because his die is really bad as far as roll-off results go. So you've got to choose wisely, my friends, because you can only take one of these. All right, now we can actually talk about those considerations that I was referring to in the intro. And the first and foremost thing I want to highlight is that there are far fewer players using mill decks and their strategies compared to players that are using aggro decks, okay? In the majority of cases, for which I really don't have a problem postulating, those aggro players generally don't know how to play against mill decks efficiently. And because of this, mill players, generally speaking, have some advantage over players who just play straight aggro their entire life, because they may not fully understand your strategy or be aware of how you are going to go about doing what you are going to do. And I said earlier that knowing how to play against mill and how to play with mill are both crucial to your overall success and destiny. And this is why. Because if you don't know how your adversary thinks, then you are at a disadvantage. This includes being familiar with their character's abilities, how to manage their battlefield if it's in play, and the meta surrounding their potential card choices that could be in their deck. Now, that takes a lot of time, okay? And anyone outside of your above average or better players are going to be clueless in a lot of those cases. So use that. Sadly, I had to mention this all because not only is it true to a great extent, it's literally the biggest advantage that you're going to have going for you in this game. In a related matter, but also wholesomely unique, is the fact that aggro decks may often include cards in their deck specifically to counter other aggro decks. So in a matchup against you, those cards will be mostly useless to them. So cards that generate shields, reroll or remove damage-only dice, or heal characters all lose a lot of value in a mill matchup. And that's, in most cases, of course, right? Qui-Gon decks, still going to be an uphill battle because of that passive ability. But that aside, what these cards become for them are rerolls. And that can be good for you as it furthers your win condition. Every single card that they decide to discard by choice is a small step towards your victory, okay? It can also be one step closer to your demise, of course, but since we're focusing on the positive, let's leave that thought aside for a few minutes. Another advantage of building a mill deck, and often its greatest strength, is the ability to offset incoming damage through survivability. Staying alive longer is something that few aggro decks actually consider seriously, and because they function mostly off a kill or be killed strategy. So again, there's some exception to that, right? We've got Talzin decks that are kind of healing a little bit now, and we've got some other decks that throw Field Medic and Mend in. But the long game on mill is to keep your characters alive as long as possible so that you can make use of their abilities and dice. Thankfully, there are many great survival options available in the game, at least where standard is concerned. All those cards that I mentioned earlier that are bad for aggro to have against you become great for you to use against them. And since that's a primary strategy that you consider, you're going to go in on that concept far more than they're often built to manage. So shield generating cards, repeating shield generating cards are all things that are clutch for mill. Heals are a great way to stay in the game, and of course, great removal options to save yourself from heaps of damage are all ways that keep you in the game for the long haul. And since you're not spending a lot of time trying to jack up your damage like those other decks, you can really nag your opponent by hanging in there instead. This works, of course, perfectly alongside the mill strategy that you're employing to reduce their card pool and thus their options available to them. All right. So now that we've put some good thoughts in your brain, let's go visit the bad stuff. Brace yourselves. Earlier, I briefly mentioned how discard sides are super hard to find in any meaningful amount. There's only one card in the game, actually, in Destiny that has more than one discard side on its die, and that's the Interrogation Droid, which is sadly villain only. On the flip side, there are several upgrades that have 50% damage sides on them, and players with those upgrades are generally going to be satisfied taking any damage they can get just to chew through your shields or wear you down over the course of time. At its core, this puts mill players at a predictable disadvantage, okay? Because the dice that are most valuable to you are incredibly transparent. For example, just about any somewhat competitive player knows about the interaction between C-3PO and Chance Cube, and if you don't, then what you need to know is that C-3PO is trying to convert the 2 or 3 sides in a Chance Cube into discards so that you can get rid of a lot of cards, okay? It's very telegraphed, and it's handled pretty simply by removing the C-3PO die. You do that enough, and your opponent is trading 1 card to remove C-3PO die to not lose 2 or 3. That's a big win for them, and it sets you back significantly if done enough. And because the game doesn't offer enough easily accessible discard sides that you can flood the board with, mill decks are often finding themselves keeping their eggs in 1 or 2 baskets that can be easily handled should your opponent manage their resources well. And what I mean by resources is the cards in hand, in their deck, their money, their removal, all that kind of stuff, okay? Another huge disadvantage that continues to exist for mill decks in general is that they tend to be very slow decks. So with the rise of the hero vehicle decks in the Legacies meta, we've actually seen mill become, somewhat faster by comparison, but the game is actually slowing down in the Legacies blocks, which is good for mill, right? So rather than looking at it as hero is getting faster, it's that the game is actually slowing down to be about the same pace. But overall, the speed of mill decks is, makes the battlefield selection kind of a more critical choice than it ought to be. And that's where the speed problem comes in. You're already balancing wanting the extra shields versus wanting your battlefield versus survivability versus the speed of your deck. And it's a lot of factors to consider altogether. Many more, in fact, than an aggro deck, which usually boils its choices down to, do I want to go first or do I want to take shields because this deck is better, or maybe I want to take their battlefield because it benefits me, or it's the same battlefield that I use, or whatever, right? Increasing the dimensions of the choice in that taking battlefield choice or not for mill, coupled with an almost assured loss on the roll-off in more than half of the character groupings, means that you start the game at a slight disadvantage a lot of the time. And I said it was an uphill battle before, and I wasn't kidding about that. There are, of course, exceptions, to every rule, so don't take this as gospel, although it is almost universally generalizable to most mill decks, regardless of faction, okay? So the last disadvantage that I want to discuss with you is character growth within the games themselves. So generally speaking, mill decks do not use many upgrades, if at all, okay? They simply just don't have the deck space for them, as they are focusing generally on events and supports that keep them in the game longer. So an aggro deck, on the other hand, is packed with upgrades. So you're going to have to deal with those in some way over the course of time. And chances are they're going to be adding 1 or 2 more upgrades each round to their characters, making your fight increasingly difficult as the game progresses. Keep in mind, too, you're never actually going to kill off a single one of their characters either. So every single round, you have to deal with all of them for the most part. Your only recourse is to run great removal, which eventually you'll run out of, or maybe you don't draw into any on a particular turn, and that becomes a problem. And then you ask yourself, what then? Well, this isn't easy, guys, and I never said that it was. Because while this is happening, your ability to mill cards is also generally remaining fairly static throughout the game. Remember how I mentioned how few discard sides there are available in the game? Well, this is probably where it hurts the most, okay? While your opponent's power level is increasing pretty linearly throughout the game through the playing of upgrades, your ability to mill cards from the deck or the discard from their hand is staying fairly static for the most part. For example, each Jetta Partisan can still only mill 1 card off the deck, whether it's round 1 or round 4. In the same space, Jabba can only discard 2 cards from one hand per die. It never goes up. So you have to find ways to combat your opponent's power creep and keep your power level equalized. And that means playing defensively, slowly, and calculating your actions to a higher degree than most aggro decks. Are you scared yet? Well, you probably should be. But if fear is encouraging you, then let's keep going. For all the quitters who want to stop at this point, go back to your aggro decks. They're probably going to serve you better anyway. Literally. You know what, though? Mill's not all good or all bad. There's actually some things that are right in the middle that we should talk about too, but none of them are very good looking. And the first consideration that I want to talk about in this section is the mirror match, okay? And archetype mirrors or even direct deck mirrors are not the most fun games of Destiny. I mean, I guess it's subjective, but to me, it's not really that fun to play against the same exact deck that I'm playing. A lot of your survivability cards become really useless in a mill mirror, and essentially it just becomes a race to get the one key card in your deck that defeats your kind of deck. So cards like Buyout or All Quiet on the Front become big winners in your mirror matches because they give you the largest potential advantages, right? Discarding more cards than you can discard from me. Hero Mill, it builds shields that aren't going to be impacted by mill decks. Similarly, mill decks don't generally disrupt resources, so buyouts or kill switches in these games. They always end just really terribly, though, and they are not very challenging to play. There's very little interaction between the decks going on compared to the aggro matchup, where you actually feel like you're actively fighting against something constantly, right? And you're making different choices. And one thing I want to mention here, too, is something that is overlooked by players because it is not a common occurrence to see a high-level mill mirror match, okay? And this is it. In the mirror match, if both players go to upkeep and both have 0 cards in both their hand and their deck, the controller of the battlefield wins the game. So, if your opponent doesn't know that, and you can claim, even if you're at 0 cards and they're at 0 cards, doesn't matter what they do the rest of the round, resolve dice, whatever, you win. So way back at the beginning of the video, I mentioned surviving the action phase as part of the road to victory for mill decks, okay? And now this is where Hero actually has what I would consider a significant advantage over villains. Heroes get 2 different kinds of get out of jail cards in hyperspace jump and retreat. And these cards are critical to the win condition for mill decks. So much so, in fact, that if you're running yellow or red or not, and not both together, your deck essentially starts with 28 cards left to choose because these are auto includes. You have to include these cards in standard to stand a chance to win your game, because the wide card pool allows for far too many potential outs to your win condition for your opponent. I mean, even like Ancient Lightsaber is an anti-win condition in standard right now. And the idea behind these cards is that once you've met your condition on reducing their deck and hand size both to 0, you play one of these cards to end the action phase as soon as possible, and thus you end the game, giving you the victory. Sadly, Villain doesn't have any of this right now, but the hand is generally harder to hit than the deck, okay? And they do get some neat things that they can do to end the game, like lying in wait, which you've got to watch out for, because chances are it will be lurking around in their hand, just waiting for the time to play it and zero you out. Now, we've got one more consideration to discuss before we wrap this thing up, and it's time. Now, normally, aggro decks can take out their opponents in the allotted 35-minute rounds that you get in an organized play event. There's some, if 2 blue hero decks are going at each other with a lot of shield gen, those games can drag on. But unfortunately, for mill decks, because of their general construction and their lean towards survivability and extending the game through optimized removal suites and slowing the opponent's damage output down to a really low degree through the mill and the discard strategy, they may find themselves going to time in a lot of rounds and a lot of games. And I said earlier that, the game is stacked against mill because once you hit time in a round, you got to finish that round. And that gives the opponent time to defeat you or put damage on your characters in general. And that's a problem because the first tiebreaker at the end of time is damage. You always lose that race. So if you're playing a pure mill deck because you are not applying any damage to their characters, you lose. Plain and simple, if you don't win by mill in less than 35 minutes, you automatically lose the game. Doesn't matter what you did for 35 minutes, it is over. But that isn't really a problem until you consider this one other factor. Your strategy also becomes susceptible to being slow played against by your opponent. How do you combat an opponent who may be purposely trying to reach time on you so that they can win by damage? There's really no good solution to this, and that's really a problem. And there's nothing in the rules that says an opponent can't take several minutes to complete one action. There's only a section in the organized play rule on unsporting conduct, which says that a player shouldn't try to do that on purpose, but it's very open to interpretation, and it's open to that interpretation by your local judge. So my suggestion is to know your judge well and make sure he or she knows the local players well enough to make good decisions in your games should this outcome occur. Well, this video was surprisingly shorter than I thought it was going to be, and that's great. Actually, while I was writing the video, I had an epiphany for another video, which is going to be the start of a new series. It's actually going to be called The Wonderful World of Mill, and my plan is going to be to do an entry on that a month or so after each expansion is released to discuss changes to the current mill decks and the meta, something like that. This way it becomes kind of like a rolling series that is always kept mostly up to date as shifts in power curves and stuff occur. So that said, I'm really glad I had a few hours to just kick back today and get this done for you all. It had been 9 days since I did my last video. I was on vacation, and I really had a hankering to do one on a subject that may not be the most popular, but it's what I love. And, those are the sorts of videos that I make anyway. I do what I like, and I don't do what I don't like. And in fact, that video series that I was just talking about is sort of a riff on deck techs, but it's going to be, it's going to move very quickly through a number of different decks and highlight the important tech in each one of them. And, maybe drop some stats like battlefields, roll-off averages, what you want a mulligan for, obviously the character combinations, stuff like that. Also, I've been mentioning this collaboration with another content creator on my Facebook page, and that is coming very, very soon. I actually have a meeting with that person in a few hours to discuss the outline for the show and how we're going to go about shooting it. I'm really looking forward to that one. I'm like super excited to be working with this person. And if we do not get that out this week, it will probably be like mid to late next week, because there's just a lot of work that has to be done for it. And also, I'd like to make sure that it presents like the stuff that you're used to coming here for, while also being unique in its approach. And I need to set up OBS for dual cam and all that jazz. But it could be a fun project, and it might even set a precedent going forward for collaborations on the channel in the future, right? Alrighty, folks, I really do hope you enjoyed this one. If you think that there's anything else that I could have discussed in this topic, please feel free to drop them in the comments. I look forward to reading them. It's really good to be back. That's all I've got to say. So until next time, may the force be with you.